Well, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you that are joining us here at Stimson World Headquarters, perhaps morning, good evening. For those of you that are tuning in online, my name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at the Stimson Center. We are going to have a lot of fun over the course of the next 90 minutes. We've got a great lineup and a really interesting discussion, I think, in store for all of you. And I hope that all of you, both here in the room as well as those of you tuning in online, will be part of that conversation over the course of the next 90 minutes. I'm really pleased to be hosting this event in cooperation with the Institute for Economics and Peace. My good friend and colleague, Michael Collins. Michael, it's always a great pleasure to spend a little time with you, but in particularly in launching the 2024 Ecological Threat Report, which we have a brief glimpse at outside. I hope you will pick it up, but I really do commend that report to you. This year's report is in fact the fifth edition of the Ecological Threat Report. It's an assessment of threats related to food insecurity, to water risk, to natural disasters, all compounded, of course, by demographic pressures, but really is, in my estimation, a remarkable synthesis of the pressures that we are facing as an international community. We, as I mentioned, have a great lineup of speakers that are going to be joining to dissect this report and some of the challenges that we are facing. They come not just from the Institute for Economics and Peace, Jade Cooper, of course, I mentioned Michael Collins, but also we have with us Cassandra Schneider, you will hear from shortly, from the U.S. Institute for Peace, as well as Tracy Hart from the World Bank and David Bonardo from PACT, as well as our very own colleagues here at Stimson, Natalie Fiertz and the one and only, we drag him out once in a while, Andrew Hyde as well. Andrew, great to have you. Thanks for doing this as well. I really do anticipate a rich conversation over the course of the next 90 minutes about the effects of environmental challenges and those challenges as multipliers, really, of social tension and of catalysts for conflict. At Stimson, of course, we do more and are insistent that we do more than just admire the problem. So much of the conversation, I hope, is also going to be focused on really taking action and what we can do over the coming months and years to address some of these really quite acute challenges. Now, some of you in the room may be aware that we have just undergone an election here in the United States. And of course, every election has consequences for good and for bad. And so I think many of those issues at the political level, of course, will be coloring the actions that we are able to take and that we can push forward over the coming months and years. So no doubt we will be touching on some of those issues as well over the next in this particular discussion. I should note that we are, of course, in week 2 of the Climate Finance COP, and so I really would urge all of our experts participating here on the stage today, but also all of you in the room and joining online to begin to share with us and brainstorm along with us some insights on how the world of climate finance in particular, and Andrew Hyde has given a lot of thought to this here at Stimson, which of course is billions of dollars behind, unfortunately, in commitments to fund resilience efforts around the world, can catch up with the realities of the day. And so with that, again, I want to thank you all for joining. I want to encourage those of you that are joining online to please be part of this conversation, not just today, but on an ongoing basis. And that, of course, invitation goes to all of you here in the room as well. And with that, Jade, I want to welcome you to the Stimson stage once again. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you so much to all our good friends here at Stimson. I'm Jade Cooper, the Deputy Director of Americas at the Institute for Economics and Peace. I'm going to take you through a quick intro about IEP and the report, and then I'll hand you over to my colleague to take us through the key findings. So just to start, a little bit about, oh, I have a clicker, that's great. Just to start a little bit about IEP. We're an independent think tank dedicated to understanding the intersection between business, peace, and economics. We are fundamentally a peace-building organization, but we believe in leveraging data to measure peace and to improve peace. We're most known for our Global Peace Index, which ranks all countries in the world in terms of peacefulness. But we produce a number of other annual reports as well, like this one, as well as our Global Terrorism Index, which comes out in March, and also our Militarization Index, just to name a couple. So we are a global organization, but our headquarters is located in Sydney, and that's where our founder, Steve Kalalea, is from as well. But we have a truly global presence, as you can see here. We have offices in New York, in Brussels, in The Hague, in Nairobi, which we've recently moved from Zimbabwe. And we also have an office in Mexico City, from where we produce our Mexico Peace Index. And so at IEP, we offer research, training, and consulting services. And our research and consulting services are used extensively by multilateral organizations, including the OECD, the Commonwealth Secretariat, the World Bank, and many different departments at the UN. We also work with major humanitarian organizations like World Vision Institute. We have a pretty small footprint in terms of team size, but we are active in many countries around the world. We publish 10 major research reports each year, and our reach for these is in 150 countries, where the reports receive millions of views and downloads. So now I'd like to introduce you to the ETR. It's its 5th year, and we created it to better understand the linkages between conflict, peacefulness, and ecological threats. And so the report follows a similar methodology to other IEP reports, except this one actually covers a lot more countries. It's very subnational in region, in nature, which means it's broken down into the states and provinces of over 200 different countries. And it covers 9 global regions, which is essentially the entire of the world's population. There are 4 core indicators, which Brian took you through briefly before, but I'll run through them again. So it's food insecurity, water risk, demographic pressure, and the impacts of natural events. And we have assessed these threats and their effects on peace, conflict, and development. So these indicators are calculated first at the subnational level and then at the national level. We use hundreds of sources for our data, including the World Bank, World Resources Institute, and the World Food Programme. And the data is normalized and cleaned and then banded on a scale of 1 to 5 to create a composite score. And the full report is, you have a kind of a short briefing with you now, but the full report is available for free to download on our website, so I encourage you to do so. And if you're interested in the methodology, there's a little bit more about that at the back of the report as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Michael Collins, who's the Executive Director of IEP Americas, and he's going to take you through the key findings of the report.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much, Brian, for your kind words, and, of course, our group of panelists here today. So let's delve straight into the findings. So as Jade noted, the report is readily available online, usually in a kind of sort of an interactive format, meaning you can click through different areas of sort of the kinds of maps that you would see here to sort of investigate the findings. So this is a global map, which is probably a bit different from some of the other reports that you may have seen from IEP, in that, to Jade's point, that this is subnational. And it's quite rare to kind of sort of see a global map with this level of kind of sort of subnational detail, invariably because it's very hard to find data along these 3 fronts. So I'd just like to sort of perhaps draw your attention to a few of the areas where we may see a bit more nuance. So for the likes of Mongolia, for example, or Colombia, or Central America, or perhaps the eastern part of Africa, or alternatively the Asia-Pacific region there, you can see quite a lot of subnational detail. Now, the Global Peace Index, our flagship report, we produce a similar map, and if you overlay that with this map here, you see quite significant correlation. From memory, it's kind of sort of a correlation of like 0.68 or something like that. We don't really talk much about the number because the first thing that people say is, well, what does that mean? So in the report, we focus a lot more on kind of specific countries, what's happening there, and how that is overlaying with current conflict in some of these. So just about 1 billion people are living in the 50 countries with either high or very high ecological threats right now. That's expected to be 2 billion people by 2050, i.e. over the next 25 years. So before we kind of sort of delve into detail or sort of a bit more granularity, we're going to just sort of pan out a bit and focus on the four sort of broad indicators, the first one being natural disasters. So it includes the natural disasters that you see here. It doesn't include sea level rise, and that's a notable missing aspect of this to a certain degree. One of the reasons is because we're trying to create a globally comparable benchmark or measure, and a quarter of the world's countries are landlocked. So this is why we choose to focus on these particular elements here. Now, it's important to note that these kind of sort of impacts, floods, cyclones, hurricanes, natural disasters of various ilks, can be felt worldwide with similar levels of frequency. But of course, the impact of these can be radically different. The underlying characteristics of resilience or the values of resilience in those countries play a very significant role, which we're going to be delving into slightly a bit more. When we kind of sort of bring this up to the national level, though, it's actually a relatively small amount of countries that have these very high levels of natural disasters. Half of these are in sub-Saharan Africa, which is a bit more of the focus of the report this year round. So the likes of Madagascar and the Mozambique at the bottom right-hand side, for example, a lot of stuff coming in in terms of hurricanes and cyclones, Cyclone Freddy being the most recent one, but also including droughts and floods, and the same can be said for places like Burkina Faso and Niger, for example. Skip over this one here. I'm going to move straight on to the next indicator here, and this is something that isn't actually included that often when we sort of talk about, have some of these environmental conversations, and that is demographic pressure. So we are going to expect to continue to see an increasing world population globally, and that's going to be quite sort of focused on, and is unfortunately focused many times on poorer countries. So a significant amount of poorer countries and countries in conflict are going to see significant population growth over the coming years. Sub-Saharan Africa specifically is expected to grow between 70 and 30%, in some countries over 150% over the next 25 years. Now, some of this growth, and as we have seen over recent years, can create a youth bulge, which, of course, we insist to talk about in terms of both being, a challenge, but also an opportunity here. But noting that on many occasions, that youth bulge does have or does see certain correlations with an increased fragility. Youth tend to be a lot more activist, for example, and the results of that can be extremely positive, of course, but they can also lead to the contrary, which is severe repression from the state, for example. And in contrast, other parts around the world, population is expected to decline. So these are a couple of charts, and I apologize because everything's quite small on the screen here, but on the left-hand side here, that pink line that you can see going up, that's sub-Saharan Africa, the one with the largest increase, and we're kind of sort of about halfway up that line right now. Now, that's the overall population, but if we look at the youth bulge on the right-hand side graph, that same pink line, we've actually come to the top of the roller coaster, for lack of a better word. So the youth bulge in itself, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in other places, it has already gone down in practically all other places, and is due to come down soon on the African continent as well. Now, why do we choose to focus in on that particular geographical area in the report this year? And granted, the report every year chooses to focus on different themes in different places. Interestingly, if we look at overall food insecurity around the world, for example, there are more food insecure people in South Asia than in sub-Saharan Africa, but that is practically because the population in South Asia is double. It's almost 2 billion people currently in South Asia. So in terms of percentage of population in any individual countries, there's significantly higher measures of food insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa. So for those of you who maybe have sort of more of a multilateral focus, oh, wow. I'm hoping you could hear me before this, right? Okay. For those of you who kind of sort of may be looking at this a bit more geopolitically, this is just one example of the intersection of food insecurity with geopolitics. So as you can see here, a couple of notable spikes which we've chosen to highlight: the global financial crisis, COVID, and then the Russia-Ukraine war. Perhaps more interestingly are some of these upticks, or these kind of sort of tops of waves that we haven't actually featured. So that one just to the right-hand side of global financial crisis, for example, is largely weather-related phenomenon. So this was freezes in Mexico, rains in Australia, droughts in Russia and the Ukraine, combination of factors related to La Nina, for example. And I fully suspect that one on the left-hand side that you see there was that as well. Those things are very much cyclical in nature, and as you can see, contributing to the increase in global food prices. So, water and food are, of course, both intuitively and quantitatively linked. Lack of food leads to a lack of water, so there is a focus on water, and specifically irrigation and water capture in this year's report. 2 billion people currently live without access to safe drinking water, and almost double of those don't have access to safe sanitation. Most of the countries that are facing that severe water stress are in, again, the sub-Saharan area, and of course the Middle East as well. Both of those regions are expected to increase in water stress over the next 20 years. We highlight very clearly in the report, or at least try to, that water risk is not strongly correlated with water resources. Or perhaps better rephrased, is water scarcity is not necessarily related to water resources. A significant number of countries have considerable water resources, but have very low capacity to be able to manage and to make the best of those resources. So just a couple of examples. We were talking about MENA beforehand. If you think of Yemen compared to UAE, Yemen has got considerably more water than the Emirates does, but has got severe water risk. PNG, which is a country out of the Global Fragility Act, for example, has got the 5th largest global water resource, so it's 80,000 cubic meters per person, yet has got one of the highest measures of water scarcity or water stress in the Ecological Threat Report. So again, that water stress is usually, sorry, not usually, but is not as connected to water resources as we would naturally think. So that's an area that we've tried to unpack a bit in this year's report. Now, with that in mind, we wanted to sort of highlight again this sort of correlation between water scarcity, conflict, and resilience as well. So in the report, we highlight what we call 27 ecological hotspots. These are countries that have got very high levels of ecological scarcity. What do I mean by that? So they either have, for example, 40% in population increase expected within the next 25 years. Alternatively, over 40% of the population is food insecure. 20% of the population don't have access to clean drinking water, or there's over 100 deaths or displacements per 100,000 people annually, on average, over the last 20 years. In some countries, it's just one of those particular factors, and in some countries, it's all of them. Niger is a country, for example, that has got high ecological threat measures across the board. So, of course, there's going to be some kind of sort of usual suspects in here. Again, hopefully speaking to this correlation between high ecological threats and conflict. There's a GFA country in here. There are perhaps some surprises. I don't know if we've been totally across, say, Equatorial Guinea or Tajikistan. Perhaps these would probably be currently slightly more peaceful countries. But a lot of the countries here, as you can see, are either in conflict or immediately post-conflict. So here's kind of sort of a map of the same countries that you just saw. So Iraq and Syria, Afghanistan, starting from the top there, Myanmar. That would be Zimbabwe on the bottom, or right on the bottom. And then broadly, this kind of sort of band across the Sahel, as you can see here. So we're going to start kind of sort of delving into some of this in a tiny bit more detail. So in sub-Saharan Africa, these areas that have high water stresses are invariably the ones that we are seeing an increase in conflict in, and particularly in areas where there is little presence from the state. Now also, regions with historical ethnic borders do have a higher probability of conflict. That is something that is very well researched. It doesn't necessarily speak to the causes of that. I think, for example, the chopping up of Africa from the colonial powers would have contributed significantly to a lot of the ethnic tensions that we continue to see today. But nonetheless, understanding, and especially now we have the ability to look at this in a bit more of a nuanced way or in a subnational way, understanding how all of these things interplay is considerably important. One of the reasons is because oftentimes it's these very local tensions around water resources that build on ethnic tensions or ethnic conflict that are then co-opted by non-state actors or alternatively by state actors as well for their own purposes, for better or worse. I mean, you could contend, and this is mostly conjecture on my part, but if we'd say move out of the continent entirely and we'd focus on, say, Russia and the Ukraine, conceivably you could say that it was the ethnic tensions in Crimea that led or drove the conflict that then turned into what is essentially a mass geopolitical event. So we can imagine the same to be true in this. In fact, there are various examples of it, and I'll share one slide about it next. So a critical thing here that the report tries to look at is the intersection of all of these. High levels of ecological threats, ethnic boundaries, and of course a history of conflict or current conflict as well. So some examples. This green sort of area that you see here is sort of a well-known transition zone encompassing the whole of the Sahel, essentially. And this isn't necessarily, this isn't luscious, of course, and it isn't totally arid, and that's kind of the problem. Right? This is where the fighting for natural resources happens. And in fact, as you can see here, there's a likelihood that conflict's going to break out in any one of these regions above any of the others. So if you look on the left-hand side of that band, you see significant conflicts. These are the red bits in this tri-border state of Goma here between Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. On the right-hand side, you see the likes of Yemen and Ethiopia. This map is a tiny bit older, so you'd still see a lot of the conflict in Ethiopia here. But if you were to take the data from Sudan today, for example, that would coincide very much with that particular area as well. This is kind of sort of going into that tri-state border region between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And the dots that you can only just hardly see here are actually conflict. But importantly, we would need to overlay instances of terrorism on top of that. So 90% of terrorism happens in areas with high levels of conflict. This is the house of the Jaims and the Islamic states today. So this area has very much become the epicenter of terrorism globally. More people died from terrorism in Burkina Faso last year than any other country around the world. And again, this is an example of the likes of the Jaims and the likes of the Islamic states who are co-opting what are often local conflicts, including those related to water management, leveraging ethnical grievances or ethnical tensions to be able to advance their own agenda. So this is a map that doesn't actually show any of that. What we've chosen to do with this one is to actually take out conflict. The best predictor of future conflict is current conflict. So leaving that aside for a moment and focusing on particularly areas where we may have the opportunity via ecologically focused programs to help build peacefulness, these are potentially some ripe candidates, for lack of a better word. So for example, Sierra Leone or Senegal would be some good examples of that, Mozambique or alternatively Angola, or includingly, other places, the Congo, for example, parts of the DRC where there's currently no conflict, and the same could be said for Sudan, even up to Libya, for example. So these are all, again, very good places where an ecologically focused project, potentially around water irrigation, alternatively food security, can conceivably have significant impact when it comes to a peace-building perspective. So in terms of sort of the solutions-oriented section of the report, and what we try and focus in on is on this. Essentially agricultural yields and the opportunity to improve water capture and water irrigation. So on the left-hand side here, you'll see overall cereal production per capita, in this case, tons per hectare. And you'll see the sub-Saharan African region significantly lower in terms of overall agricultural yields. And also on the right-hand side, irrigation coverage is much, much smaller than you would see practically anywhere else around the world. Now, part of it is for good reason. There's actually a considerable part of Africa that is rain-fed. but it does speak to, especially in times of an increasing population and increasing food insecurity, as well as water stress, the opportunity that exists to be able to irrigate and to capture new ways of, and to capture water in new ways. So here's an example of how water resources are not necessarily correlated with water stress. Based on the analysis, the water could essentially irrigate all of its lands, all of the ones that have irrigation potential, using less than 6% of its current renewable water resources. Now, when we say irrigation potential, we're talking about both cultivated and uncultivated land, but one that realistically, using current technologies, and we're not talking about precision agriculture, we're not talking about monocropping, we're talking about the technologies that are available to the average farmer that has less than 2 hectares. So that's very much what the analysis has been based on. Now, of course, on top of that, you can add in all kinds of sort of different advancements to be able to increase this, but we estimate that using some of these irrigation investments that we're going to be talking about now, food insecurity in Africa could be reduced by 50% with what is actually a relatively small investment, the one that you can see here, $15 billion a year. Now, this might seem like a whole bunch, but as Brian alluded to, you know, and as Andrew will no doubt be talking about, there are trillions of dollars currently being, you know, discussed for climate financing. 15 billion is actually a drop in the bucket. It's about 2% of foreign direct investment in the African continent. It's about 15% of the overseas development aid that the continent received last year. So it's considerably small, and relatively little amount of current funding goes towards water irrigation and agriculture. So here's kind of sort of the breakdown of what that would look like, and of course in the report we get into this in significantly more detail. So you have the current production, 176 tons per hectare. An estimated, you could gain an estimated 40 tons per hectare by realizing all of the irrigation potential of those current lands. And again, fundamentally, we're talking about solar pipes, we're talking solar pumps, we're talking about plastic piping, we're talking about very simple technologies that many people already leverage. From the perspective of capturing water from areas where it is currently not available, there is still quite a bit of potential there. Not only in basic forms, such as the use of sand dams, for example, which is a very basic technology, but also leveraging more advanced technologies for tapping new water wells. Fertilizer can actually contribute a significant amount. Now, that's kind of sort of contentious, and for good reason. There's a number of countries that including the United States and European countries, who use significant amounts of fertilizer to the point in which the land becomes arid, alternatively acidic, and can't be used. But moderate and responsible increases in fertilizer can lead to significantly higher agricultural yields. So 10 kilos of nitrogen fertilizer, for example, can increase agricultural yields by 0.3 of a ton per hectare. Now, that's significant when what you're trying to do, or almost have to do, when you account for the increasing population, food insecurity, is essentially double food production around the continent. That investment that I talked about can get us halfway there. It's not all the way, but it's a big push. And then there's a small modicum of basic improvements to infrastructure and to storage, for example, that can help with improving agricultural yields as well. So I realize we've been through a ton of stuff, and we went through it super quickly. Again, all of the detail is available in the report. But I very much hope that I've raised more questions, because we're going to be having our wonderful panel who's going to help us answer as many of those as we can. So with that, thank you very much, and I'd like to hand over to our fantastic panel.
I think your water somehow made it to that table. David's got 2.
That's right.
Okay.
She needs one.
Yeah, David's got one on both sides.
Okay. All right. I think he's got one of those sides.
We have a water scarcity issue going on.
Redistribution.
Yeah, there we go.
6%. We only get 6% of the water.
Modest investments. All right, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Michael and Jade, for your walkthrough of the report. The full report really is very fascinating, and I do heavily encourage you all to peruse the full thing. My name is Natalie Fiertz. I am with the Environmental Security Program here at Stimson, and I am joined by these fantastic panelists, and we're going to hear what they have to say about some of the key points that Michael provided an overview on. But first, I want to provide just a couple of minutes, if you'll bear with me, to put us in a little bit more context for where we are at the moment. Particularly as this is the second week of the COP negotiations over in Baku, I wanted to note a couple of sort of where we are on the effort to fight climate change. So we continue to see record temperatures, and 2024 is the first calendar year in which global temperatures consistently rose more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Emissions are still growing, with 2024 global emissions projected to rise by 0.8% compared to the previous year. And a recent UN report found that the world is on track for 3.1 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And we've seen those impacts throughout the year, but even just recently, over the last couple of months, we've seen over 300 people die in Typhoon Yagi in Vietnam. That same typhoon caused landslides in Myanmar, which several hundred more people died in. We saw severe flooding in Spain, in Valencia. In Maiduguri, in Nigeria, a dam burst displaced 70% of the residents of the state of Borno. And in Nepal, also, we have seen very heavy flooding and landslides, which killed over 200 people. And that's just in the past couple of months alone. However, there is some good news that have come out of negotiations so far at COP29. A draft copy of the new climate goal text around the new collective quantified goal mentioned conflict and fragility a number of times around the idea that there should be special financing directed towards these places given their higher level of vulnerability. And we've also seen progress on the implementing the loss and damage fund that was agreed last year, as well as new commitments announced for that fund. So that's sort of where we are at the present moment, continuing to have, climate change is continuing to grow more damaging throughout the world as, and exacerbating many of the environmental challenges that Michael highlighted. So with that, I want to introduce our speakers and turn to them. So from my left, we have Andrew Hyde, the Director and Senior Fellow of the Multilateral Financial Diplomacy and Powering Peace Programs here at the Stimson Center. We have Tracy Hart, the Lead Environmental Specialist for Environment and Natural Resources Global Practice at the World Bank. We have David Bonardo as the Director of Environment and Energy at PACT, and Cassandra Schneider, a Senior Climate, Energy, and Conflict Program Officer at the United States Institute for Peace. So thank you all for joining me here on the stage today to discuss some of the things around the report that Michael talked about. So first, I want to turn to Tracy. So, as has been mentioned, this year's COP conference has been called the Climate Finance COP, and a lot of, financial questions have really been center stage during negotiations. And one thing that Michael highlighted towards the end of his presentations was how relatively modest targeted investments could have a really positive impact in reducing conflict and climate risk. Yet the Closing the Gap report published by the World Bank this summer showed that how countries affected by climate and fragility receive significantly less climate adaptation compared to other low-income countries. So what can institutions like the World Bank do to help close that gap and help direct funding to those communities where they're so urgently needed?
Thanks for your question. So what I did, because I had this question, was I contacted Lindsay Jones, who is the author of the Closing the Gap report, and asked him how he would respond to this question. And he guided me to a report that is available online called Opportunities for Scaling Access to Climate Finance in Fragile and Conflict Settings, Insights from a Solutions Workshop, which has 18 different proposed solutions for how to get us closer to some sort of equity in climate finance with fragile and conflict states. And if you can't find it online, let me know. Just send me an email. You can find me, and I'll make sure that you have a copy of the report, because it is it's a thin workshop proceeding, because it is publicly available. And so Lindsay said, of these 18 points, here are the 3 that really might be most useful to talk about. One is that we need to help strengthen the public financial management infrastructure in fragile and conflict states. Because if you talk about capacity and capacity constraints to absorb climate finance, you really have to disaggregate that into what does that mean, and how can we address that as we're trying to increase the absorptive capacity. And so being able to work with fragile and conflict states on their public sector management in terms of financial management, procurement, transparency, et cetera, is really important to also establish trust in being able to invest in those fragile and conflict states. Secondly, we do need some coordination across actors, because, to be very blunt, there's a tremendous amount of competition on the implementing side, on our side, across peace building and security and humanitarian development, the disaster risk management, all of these implementation actors and institutions who want to use the hot vehicle of climate finance for self-preservation. And we are part of the problem, to be clear. And we have different comparative advantages, and we have different roles to play in terms of scale and our utility to help perhaps channel and implement some of these funds. But we should not be in the driver's seat. The countries that will be receiving these funds should be. Let's be clear. Thirdly, I just say that in terms of fragile and conflict states, it's really important to understand that there is a plethora of types of fragile and conflict states. There are states that are kind of in a cycle of fragility but never reach conflict, as we were seeing. There's countries that are in high conflict, where it's very difficult to actually take money and use it for climate financing on the ground. There's these low and moderate intensity conflicts, that some of those are quite protracted, but in only some areas of a country and not in most of the areas. And so it's really hard to talk about a singular type of fragile and conflict state with respect to how it receives and uses climate financing. So that's just 3 ways in which we begin to offer solutions to this.
Thank you. Cassandra, I want to turn to you next. One of the major areas that this year's Ecological Threat Report highlighted was how water risk can increase the incidence of conflict. And there was a major report recently from the Pacific Institute underlining how violence over water resources increased dramatically last year. Now, in your work, what do you see as being some of the major reasons for this spike in violence, and how can peace-building institutions work to prevent and respond to it?
Thank you, Natalie. It's a pleasure to be here today. If I may, I'd like to offer a few clarifying points before responding to your questions. First, cooperation and conflict are on a spectrum, and not all conflict is violent. So it's important to keep in mind when we're talking about an increase in conflict that we're not necessarily talking about an increase in violence. Historically, cooperation prevails more than conflict between states over water. So largely what we're talking about in the incidents that were recorded for 2023 is subnational level conflict. Second, the vast majority of the increase in these violent incidents last year were cases in which water, or water infrastructure in particular, was actually a casualty of conflict, not a cause. And I think that's a really important distinction, because when we're talking about violence, there is that image that comes to mind of person-on-person violence as opposed to person-on-infrastructure violence, and then the fallout that results from that. And so this means that conflict actors are increasingly using water as a tool or a tactic in war, destroying access to water, and with it, food security, livelihoods, and public health. So key examples of this being, of course, what's happening in Israel and Palestine and in the Ukraine and Russia war. That being said, of course, climate change is putting tremendous pressure on water resources around the world, and increasing scarcity is a real phenomenon. But like in other types of conflict, this is not a single variant question. There are a multitude of factors that drive conflicts related to water, two of the key ones being lack of governance and, of course, perceived marginalization, neither of which really have much to do with water at all, which is, of course, heavily noted throughout the ETR. So when we're talking about how do we address this, I'd like to distinguish based on the type of violence that's noted in the Pacific Institute report. First, acts of violence in which water scarcity is a trigger. Supporting governments with improving water infrastructure and water delivery systems is key. A major piece of this, to piggyback off what Tracy said, is really building that public budgeting capacity and helping governments understand how to use their often limited resources to maximize equitable access to clean water resources. And then beyond that, looking at water as a weapon or water as a casualty of conflict, I really think this comes back to dialogues and to really having some of those important conversations, not just at the national government level, but also really engaging communities who are bearing the brunt of these issues in those conversations so that they can start thinking critically about how to manage their own risk.
Thank you. All right, David. So something that's been touched on again and again from Tracy's answer to Cassandra's answer and Michael's comments, and something that we've seen repeatedly in our work here at Stimson, is how the impacts of conflict and climate risk and their solutions are very locally specific. The way a community is governed, what its environment looks like, where its residents work, and how they relate to another all shape sort of how these phenomenon play out. And in your work, how do you respond to that sort of local nature of risk, and how do you build on local institutions to build resilience?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about these important issues. Well, first and foremost, where I come from, PACT, or NGO, what we focus on is developing the capacity of local communities and those who ultimately impinge on local communities, rural development or urban development. So I'd say first and foremost, it's that issue of, as Tracy noted, it's ensuring that capacity is there. And we like to say it's developing capacity. We're not building capacity, as there's already nascent capacity there. We're just building on top of it. So it's developing that capacity and not just technical aspects. So, but let me take a step back. So what we look at first is understanding what that risk is, carrying out contextual climate change vulnerability assessments, understanding what are the issues, what are the risks, what is the capacity to adapt to these risks, and then co-designing programs, action plans, adaptation plans with the local communities. So that's how we engage first, and then it's a matter of understanding how to develop those capacities. So as I mentioned, we co-design these tools. We're not coming in saying that we have the answers and the solutions, but we work together understanding what are the capacities already there. We look at sort of traditional knowledge, understanding quite often, for example, in Zimbabwe, where we've done some work, local communities are going back to sort of bushmeal, for example, to be able to feed their livestock because they don't have the resources to go in and buy feed from shops and from agri businesses. So we're looking at supporting, amplifying these traditional means, traditional ideas, and then developing capacity, but not just technical capacity in terms of climate-smart agriculture, which we all know and understand has a value there, but understanding how to develop organizational capacities, institutional capacities. Goes back to this point that Tracy made around understanding how to amortize and manage all the climate finance that we hope will be able to flow down to governments, national and provincial and local, as well as the community-based organizations, social enterprises at the local level. So it's providing them the understanding of human resources, financial management, strategic planning, all things that if you do not have, whatever technical know-how and knowledge we provide will ultimately be wasted in time. And we see that a lot, particularly in the environmental space, conservation space, where you have a very enigmatic leader of a local NGO who, as often as unfortunately we're seeing, a lot of them dying, being killed, environmental defenders being killed, and then that local entity, that local organization behind it not being able to withstand that shock because they've relied on one individual being able to provide funding from their road trips that they do around the world. So that's where we engage communities, community-based organizations to develop that capacity. I'll give you one example. We're doing this in Zimbabwe, where we've developed, carried out an assessment, climate change vulnerability assessment, to understand the impacts on orphans and vulnerable children and their caregivers, a group that often goes ignored. And understanding what are those specific issues in terms of outmigration due to economic shocks, but also climate shocks, impacts on ARV, antiretroviral medicines, and the fact that they are malnourished as a result of lost harvests due to exacerbated by climate impacts, for example, Cyclone Idai, and so therefore not retaining that medicine in their system. Or being able to even reach the medical clinics to be able to get their ARVs. So looking at ways that we can improve batches of getting their medicines, for example. So it's really just a matter of understanding that we're meeting communities where they are in terms of the fact that their lives are integrated rather than just focusing on one aspect, but looking really at the full system, essentially, looking at it in a bit of a systems thinking way.
All right, thank you. Andrew, one of the major sort of reforms from the US government that we saw in recent years is the Global Fragility Act, which was passed in 2019 as really a headline reform to the way that the US government conducts conflict prevention and stabilization operations. And earlier this year, the Biden administration released a 10-year stabilization and conflict prevention plan, which was a major milestone in the implementation of the GFA. So we're sort of 5 years from the passage. How would you evaluate sort of where we've gotten over the last 5 years since the act was passed, and what should we expect over the next 5 or so?
Well, one of those is easier than the other, I will say. So yes, the Global Fragility Act, which was passed in 2019, as you say, in the previous administration, not this administration, was really a landmark act in many ways for the U.S. government specifically, the interagency process and the coherence by which the U.S. government comes to these problems and these issues. Initially, I think it was a little bit derided by some for really not involving extra amounts of money, and that's the currency here in the Beltway and in Washington, and in many ways, is to say, well, what's different here? What's new? And it wasn't in the money part. Where I think it actually did succeed and has succeeded, and as I think that update shows, the 5-year update shows, is really adding a conflict and fragility lens to so many things that the U.S. government is doing across the 3 Ds: defense, diplomacy, and development. And really trying to bring that frame, if you will, in certain places where they've decided to focus, and I'll come back to that in a minute, to really think through, well, what are we doing, what should we be doing next, and how do we put conflict sort of front and center, or fragility front and center on that. Now, I think quite remarkably in some ways, there was a very painful process, I think, initially after the act was passed, because the act really designated the administration and the 3 agencies I mentioned, USAID, State Department, and the Defense Department, to come up with a short list of countries where they would focus their efforts. And they did come up with 4 countries and then a region: coastal West Africa, and then the other 4 countries, we've mentioned some of them: Haiti, Libya, Mozambique, and Papua New Guinea. And so they've really dug in deep in those countries to look at what is the U.S. government doing in things like security cooperation and development assistance, in diplomatic outreach and the bilateral relationship, to really kind of keep looking at what do we do to ameliorate and mitigate conflict. Now, I've heard themes from all 3 of my fellow panelists that I think that the Act also represents. So one is that it's a long-term approach. again, that was sort of gave rise to a little cynicism initially, kind of like, well, this is a lot of small stuff that's going on. Where's the big bang? And this is going to really tackle conflict in this place or this region in the next 12 months. That was not what the act was designed to do, and frankly, that wasn't going to happen under any circumstances. So long-term sustainability of sort of policy and approaches was one key thing. And then the other thing, and all of us have mentioned it, is really locally driven. Really going back, now that's time consuming, but going back and saying, what is it you need? What is going to be solving your problems? Help us with this. It's a partnership. You tell us in what ways you feel the US government particularly, but also as a platform, if you will, or leveraging other partners in the civil society, other nations, international organizations. What can we be doing together to actually advance your goals and your processes so that what we do, what kinds of programs come actually are sustainable over the long run. Now, just a couple of examples I'll say really quickly. Like in Haiti, we know the current crisis in Haiti. It's terrible. It's a terrible situation. It needs a lot of international help. There are efforts going on, obviously, at the United Nations, the US government. There's been a lot of money poured into that. Again, that's not what the Fragility Act was for. The Fragility Act is to try to look past the immediate crisis, if that's possible, and say, what does Haiti need over the long term? That's been the problem in the past. We've always been putting the Band-Aid on and trying to deal with things as we see them and really not thinking longer term. In Libya, the Global Fragility Act strategy, which came out in the White House fact sheet and the 5-year review, was really sort of saying, let's look at the locally driven solutions. And the nice thing about this report, I think, is really very importantly focuses on the subnational dynamics. And that's, if you know anything about Libya, that's so important in Libya, because what's going on in different parts of the country is dramatically different. So the responses, the solutions need to be dramatically different. And then in Mozambique, final example I'll just mention that I think, again, they highlighted, and it was very reassuring, and this came up earlier in the remarks, was that, what is the effect of sea rise in Mozambique on conflict and on possible solutions and answers to addressing sort of long-term conflict dynamics. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, Tracy, I want to turn back to you. So one thing I think that's fairly intuitive for all of us to understand is how declining resource availability can lead to conflict. Now, what we've, I think, heard again and again is the story is not always so simple, but that's often one that makes some sort of sense to the casual observer. But one thing that we spoke about earlier was how the increase in the quantity or value of a resource can also contribute to conflict risk. So can you talk to us a little bit about sort of how that happens, what that looks like, and potentially how the increase in mineral values around the green transition may have negative consequences?
Sure. So one thing I would note is that there are several stories that are kind of counterintuitive when you look at the relationship between natural resource management, valuation, and conflict. And one is that you actually see the largest increases in natural resource demand post-conflict. The militias leave the forest, people want to build their houses again, they want to build their businesses, and in a case like Colombia, you see there was a huge demand for natural resources, especially wood, post-conflict. And there was relatively little demand during conflict. With regards to large changes in the quantity and, let's say, the value of natural resources, we could look at the fluctuations in cocoa price. We could look at lithium, copper, cadmium, and diamonds, gold, and the fact that these all provide flashpoints for conflict, most notably in sub-Saharan Africa, but elsewhere. And I think we will have more of an accentuation in conflict as we try to move off of a fossil fuel-driven environment or financing for some of these countries and switch into more renewable energy. And so we are seeing huge amounts of subnational conflict in DRC, in parts of the Sahel over artisanal mining, because there is really fairly little benefit sharing or distribution of rewards beyond those who extract and export minerals. And so it basically raises expectations on parts of communities that they're going to benefit from resource extraction, and then these expectations get dashed. And so part of what we should be doing more of, let's say, is strengthening national natural resource governance of some of these countries where elite capture has been the name of the game in terms of making sure that people get their cut of mineral exports. We should be trying to bolster community participation in private sector management of some of these mineral areas. And I just would say, when I first came into this arena in the 1980s, I came in at the tail end of the Cold War, at least in Africa. And we've really come full circle in that we now have a new Cold War in Africa over the management of natural resource assets and who has access to them, with China, with Russia, with private sector entities, both on the West and kind of the non-West side. So it is an area where we will see undoubtedly much more conflict instead of much less.
Thank you. Cassandra, another emphasis in this year's Ecological Threat Report was how climate change can act as a threat amplifier, and how non-state actors, particularly such as transnational jihadist groups, can co-opt local grievances over resource management to recruit followers and escalate conflict. We certainly heard that from Michael's overview. How can governments in the affected areas manage this risk, and what is the proper role of governments in DC and elsewhere to support those efforts?
Thank you, Natalie. I was really pleased to see that this was highlighted in the ETR this year. This is a problem that is near and dear to my heart for a lot of reasons, but I think a couple of key things here. First, high-stress environmental events, whether they be long-term, such as droughts, or short-term high-impact events like damage from a hurricane, have a profound impact on community resilience, and particularly on people's abilities to meet their own basic needs we spoke about before, from food security to livelihoods to shelter to public health, etc. So when an event like this happens and communities are in dire need of support, they will inevitably turn to whomever provides that support first. So I think to answer your first question, what role can governments play here? They have to act in advance of that. They have to be the first boots on the ground, if you will, and really fill that gap and address those needs as quickly as possible, or suffer the consequences because somebody else inevitably will. A couple of key examples of that. First, we've seen this play out for decades all over the world. This is not a new concept. In 2019, twin cyclones devastated northern Mozambique. The central government's delayed response in a historically marginalized part of the country that was already struggling with conflicts around foreign extraction opened the door for the Islamic State to leverage local grievances and infiltrate local conflict dynamics. Their presence further legitimized these local grievances to the point of catalyzing a broader conflict that ended up involving regional African Union forces, regional country forces, and of course Russian mercenaries, among others, to try to quell the violence. We've already heard a number of examples around herder-farmer conflicts and other water-related conflicts that have been infiltrated by some of these transnational groups. But to offer an example a little bit closer to home, which some of you may have seen, the Washington Post article that came out a couple of weeks ago, in the wake of Hurricane Helene, non-state militias provided support to North Carolina communities beyond the reach of the government disaster response. These groups are known for their anti-government sentiment and penchant for conspiracy theories, But in the chaos of the devastation, communities had little choice but to rely on whatever support they could get, regardless of who was supporting it. So I think these non-state militias ultimately undermined the US government response and contributed to an unbelievable amount of disinformation in the wake of the disaster. And so I think we have a tendency, of course, in all of our positions, focusing internationally to think about these as faraway problems, but they're not. And I think for those of us who have been kind of following the rise of these non-state armed groups around the world, this was not a particular surprise. So, but instead of focusing on that, what could we have done differently? What could the government of Mozambique have done differently? What could the governments of Burkina Faso and Iraq and Syria and every other country around the world that's dealing with these issues have done differently to stem the rise of some of these groups? The first thing is plan ahead. We know these disasters are coming. We know that they're going to continue to increase in frequency and in severity, and that is such powerful knowledge to have, to be able to work with communities up front to prepare them and really work on disaster readiness and work on building out effective early warning systems so that when these events do occur, both communities and governments are prepared to respond. The second piece of that is the governments really need to hone in on consistent and regular messaging so that they can really be clear about what it is that they're doing and make sure that that information is getting to communities that need it most in the wake of disasters, so that people know how to respond, they know help is on the way, they know how long it's going to take before it gets there, and they can start to prepare themselves accordingly.
All right, thank you. So we've talked a lot today about how shortcomings in natural resource management can increase fragility and conflict risk. But Andrew and David, I actually want to ask this to both of you. Parts of your work have focused instead on how strengthening resource management can serve as a lever to build peace and reduce conflict risk. What kinds of approaches and projects are most effective in advancing that goal? And how, in other words, do we move from climate conflicts to environmental peace building?
Please.
Thank you both. A couple of examples. We have a USAID project at the moment called the Tanganyika Conflict Mitigation Reconciliation Project. It's funded by USAID CMMs, Conflict Mitigation Management Mechanism. But what we did, and we encouraged USAID to build it into the design, is to have in place a community-based natural resource management component, as well as a broader sort of services component regarding sort of food security and health, because these are the issues that can result in and become flashpoints for conflict, be it sort of in areas of where pastoralists are sharing grazing sites or fisheries areas in Lake Tanganyika. And so we have been very successful in developing this part of this project, on top of all the other work that's going on with peace committees and ensuring grievance mechanisms are in place. It's ensuring that they have, particularly for those that are coming back into sort of returnees, internally displaced peoples, that are coming back into areas that were once rife with conflict, to have their basic needs met. And so, and that's not just from the government perspective, which of course does play a big part, but it's also their self-reliance, being able to develop their own sort of livelihoods. For example, we support them with working with the University of Kalemi in North Kivu to develop seed nurseries to be able to restore certain areas and be able to also have an ingress of income there as well as they sell that seed to others in the community. We work to support their capacity in terms of fisheries management, to understand that where to put in place sanctuaries to mitigate impacts of overfishing, as climate is having an impact in terms of lake dynamics. Certain fish are finding refuge in certain areas where before they weren't. And so understanding where those refuges are and then relaying that to the communities to ensure that they can then manage those resources accordingly. Another example of the work we did actually in Ethiopia, where we've talked about so one part, the Amhara part, but actually what we've talked about is conflict in terms of warring factions like the Bantu and Twa in DRC, but also conflict amongst communities, indigenous communities, in this case Majan communities in southwestern part of Ethiopia, and agribusinesses, conflict for water. And water abstraction that's occurring for, in this case, for sugarcane plantations, and also for land. And so we supported those communities to develop and strengthen their community cooperatives, forestry cooperatives, and ensure they understand how to demarcate their land and being able to have that security of tenure, which is obviously such a big flashpoint as well, which is also increasing more and more so as we are seeing the climate dynamics impacting where people can actually plant their crops. And so we've shown that in that regard that was very advantageous for the communities, that ensure that they were able to then be able to invest in their own value chains, in this case pepper and some other value chains, and be able to export that going forward. But without that secure land tenure, they couldn't do so. A couple of examples I have, but I'll cede the floor to Andrew and see what else he might add.
Thanks very much. So actually before this event, Tracy and I were talking briefly, and I was mentioning that one of the cornerstones of the work I've been doing here, or one project that I'm very involved in here called Powering Peace, one of its cornerstones has really been looking at peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping, and its effect and its impact on the climate. And part of this, I think, takes place in the larger context that we were discussing, which is really the shift from fossil fuels to renewable or green energy, and the fact that that in itself can produce additional amounts of conflict, as Tracy was mentioning, but perhaps also carry with it the longer-term seeds for a conflict reduction. Now, in this area with the peacekeeping, obviously the largest UN peacekeeping missions are in countries that are facing a lot of conflict by definition. What I think most people don't realize is that UN peacekeeping missions actually in some cases consume up to a fifth of the electricity consumed in the whole country. That's power that they produce themselves, so it's not part of the national grid, but it gives you a sense of the scale at which the UN is using electricity. So a number of UN peacekeeping mandates actually have climate in their mandate in terms of how they're supposed to be looking at, in a strategic way, carrying out their peacekeeping duties. But not every mission. That's not the role, that's not the mandate that's been put into it. But I think what we've discovered and we've seen is that it's not just the strategy or the policies they're pursuing, it's their behavior, their activities that make such a difference. And so we've been asking a lot of tough questions of peacekeeping and trying to frame the conversation within the peacekeeping community, and especially in the largest ones. How can we move you towards renewable energy? How can we remove diesel fuel supply chains that cause conflict, that are temptations to armed groups, that have very local impact? How can we move this to the UN peacekeeping using renewable sources, removing a lot, if not all of that diesel supply chain? But more importantly, in a sense, how can we use UN peacekeeping sites, which are dozens around many countries? It's not just one big base somewhere, there are dozens. How does that become a platform for providing renewable energy to surrounding communities where, in fact, that they can build off of that, and some of the economics of renewable energy, which we have seen across the world, can be transferred and translated into a conflict environment. And that actually brings me back to one other thing I just want to mention that I think both Tracy and Cassandra mentioned earlier on the public sector side. This is very important, obviously, how the governments, host nations in the peacekeeping context manage the possibility, the green transition. But I think we all would agree that the green transition is really not going to work anywhere if the private sector isn't a big piece of that. And so I want to sort of enlarge the lens a little bit, because you talked about public sector procurement and regulations. I want to enlarge it because this is what we're seeing on the peacekeeping side, to look at tax and regulatory regimes as well, and actions of governments. We've seen a lot of cases where, in fact, even renewable energy equipment is held hostage by members of government forces trying to extract value and money from it. And so strengthening the institutions beyond just the public acquisition side, I think is vitally important in this area. I'll leave it at that, but I think the frame of peacekeeping, it's not by any means the only answer, but it is an opportunity, I think, to provide energy access to a wider community, to distribute that energy access, to make it more equitable, and ultimately through economic development to help reduce the chance of conflict. Thanks.
All right, thank you. I want to ask just one more question, actually, of all of you before I open it up for Q&A. So returning to the theme of COP, since that is going on right now. We're in the second week of negotiations. Things should be wrapping up soon. Sort of briefly, what are you most hoping to see out of that whole process by the time it concludes?
It's $1 million question.
Or more, in this case.
Yes.
Well, maybe I'll jump in on that question around that just energy transition. And that gets kind of lost. We hear a lot about retraining of local communities, or rather, sort of, even sort of urban populations in terms of these new technologies. But we're also losing sight of the fact that, in terms of carbon markets and carbon credits and offsetting projects, that issue there in terms of indigenous peoples, local communities being sort of run roughshod over by private sector, or being termed carbon cowboys. And they are there. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche term, but it is happening. We've seen this the case in Colombia, where indigenous peoples group have gone into an agreement with a Colombian management consulting firm, a carbon consulting firm, and they've basically co-opted and taken the full area of their reserve under this carbon project with very little data, very little understanding of what it means, what it means to them. And so when we came in and they were asking us to support them, to bring in more transparency into this agreement, our hands were tied. We weren't part of this agreement to begin with, but we had worked with this entity in the past, and so they understood that PACT comes with that understanding and knowledge and ability to and trust. But unfortunately, we couldn't do anything. But we're seeing this time and time again, where these local communities, indigenous peoples organizations, do not have the wherewithal, understanding, to negotiate these deals. And so, that what I would love to see out of this is more out of this being the COP29. Greater understanding of what we can do to support local communities to be true brokers and players in this space, and ensure that finance does ultimately reach them and their local and their communities.
Maybe I'll just make a couple of sort of obvious and maybe realistic comments, but a lot of people, even months ago, saw this as a bridging COP from Dubai last year, Brazil COP30 next year. And I think there's a lot of truth in that for various reasons. One of the things I think in that area we're seeing play out is obviously the role of the energy sector and large energy companies and fossil fuels. And I think there's a lot of still discomfort, understandably, about kind of what role they should be playing or can play, or what spoiler role they might play. I think there's some very useful progress being made in that area at this point. I'll be optimistic. I think others could maybe be pessimistic, but I'll be optimistic. And I think there's a little bit of a reconciliation going on. But then the obvious one, to be honest, here we are sitting 5 blocks from the White House. We're going to have a big change in a few months in the U.S. government and the U.S. leadership on this score. And so I think it's no secret that the COP29 has been a little bit dominated by wondering, well, where is the U.S.? Is the U.S. going to be as active? Probably not. Is it going to play a spoiler role? Possibly. So I think in a sense it's overshadowed this COP, maybe necessarily so, but I think that's going to be a direction where, again, bridging into COP30 next year in Rio, I think there'll be a lot clearer understanding as to what's possible and what the goals might be.
Do you have anything to add?
Oh, I mean,
On that high note.
there's a reason why I'm here and not at the COP, which is that I really do generally have very little faith in COPs to move the needle for local communities. I said it. You can quote me on it. There's a ton of COP fatigue. This fall, we've gone from a biodiversity COP to now the climate COP. Then there'll be the desertification COP in a few weeks. It's a lot of the same players. The behind the scenes, some of these COPs have been very contentious with regards to global north and global south, with a lot of vitriol, not a lot of coming to the table with concrete agreements. I see that probably happening here. What I hope, and that's what you asked for, is what I hope is, first of all, this idea that David has of voice and elevating local voices and marginalized and vulnerable and indigenous voices. I always hope for that. Secondly, I really hope for increased metrics. I've been working the last couple of years on trying to figure out how to measure and monitor conflict reduction at the community level to see because if we can't measure it and monitor it, then we cannot say that we're supporting communities in doing it. And so the metrics of, let's say, climate financing and what actually finances a change on the ground, what is that financing trying to do? How will we know if it works? How will we know if it's efficient? Those are the things I really want more focus on, because we can enlarge the pie of climate financing all we want, and people can fight over how big the pie is and what their slice is. But if we really don't understand how financing is able to contribute to a change in climate, all hope is lost as far as I'm concerned. And that's where I want to see more work in that space and more agreement to work in that space as well.
Thank you.
I share your skepticism in COP's ability to really make a difference at a community level. But I also share your hope. And I think for me, coming from a development background, working on USAID projects, working to support governments in the development of national adaptation plans, and seeing this enormous disconnect between what's happening at a national level in terms of planning and how that trickles down to impact at the people of a country. For me, that's something that I hope with this increase in voices at the various COPs that we can start to bridge that divide and really have conversations about how to engage communities more meaningfully in their own adaptation, instead of just spoon feeding them a plan and saying, okay, well, your home is no longer livable, so you're going to have to move here instead and figure it out once you get there. Engage them, have these conversations, make sure that their voices are heard, so that when that day comes, there's some level of community buy-in into whatever that adaptation strategy would be. And similarly with mitigation, we talked about the role of the private sector and how important that is for all of these solutions, but I think really diversifying the voices in the room is helpful.
All right, thank you. With that, I want to open it up to questions from the audience, both here in person and online. We'll receive the questions. And if you have a particular person in mind, please let us know sort of who you're directing the question to. And a reminder that Michael is going to come back on the stage here for any questions you have about the Ecological Threat Report itself. And we've got a mic to run.
Bring it on.
People. All right, so I'll start it off with a question from online. In the South China Sea, we've seen numerous sort of state and non-state actors vying for territorial control of the resource-rich marine space. Sort of how can governments leverage resource management and conservation to support peace building? And perhaps if we want to make it a little more broad, sort of how can governments work between each other to effectively manage resources that do stretch across national boundaries like that?
I could take a quick one. This is some work that PAC did with the Stimson Center and Eyes on Earth, Alan Basist, based out of Bangkok. We were looking at a wetness index, Alan Basist was, and overlaying that with different seasons and looking at essentially the shortage, the water shortage issue along the Mekong River. And over many years, we've not seen, China has not been able to not share data from the Lancang river, upstream part of the Mekong, which is impacting all those cascade dams on the lower reaches of the Mekong, having huge impacts in terms of salinization and lack of water down all the way down to the delta. And so what this work that Alan Basis did was show that actually there was data, speaking of data, that shows that unequivocally that it was to do that the shortages and droughts happening downstream in Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand were absolutely to do with the management of the reservoirs upstream. It's a no-brainer, but we had data to show for it. And it actually then, whether it was actually to do with that paper or all the decades worth of water diplomacy that had been going on, we still don't know for sure, but the Chinese did ultimately decide to provide more data and share more data across the board in a lot of their different water gauging stations in the Lancang. So a huge win, which is now going to allow the downstream countries to be able to manage their resources better and reduce the impacts on local communities. So that was part of a broader water data sharing project that PACT was doing with State Department funding. And so I think that there's hope there to be able to try and breach that divide in terms of transboundary water management.
Great. Any questions in the room? Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so at the Stimson Center, we've developed this program called the Climate and Ocean Risk Vulnerability Initiative. It looks at 100 different risk indicators across economic, ecological, and social political, so conflict. And what I've heard today is complete music to my ears. It's all about subnational. It's all about local, and that's what we find. Yet, on the financing piece, you have finance here, you have the local community needs over here, and there's that valley of death in the middle of lack of confidence for the financial folks to get over and provide resources on all of these issues. What do you think needs to be done for us to close that gap, the finance gap, to give them the confidence they need to move forward?
Please.
Oh, this is a question from me, from Andrew. Thank you.
No, from Sally.
I was just thinking to myself, I mean, the World Bank is really hobbled by the fact that we lend to national governments, and that's our MO. So, so privately, I relish those, my colleagues from PACT and other places who don't have to have the conduit of going from a national government Ministry of Finance through a sectoral ministry, hoping that it gets to the ground. I mean, there's leakage, obviously. Or if it's not leakage, the flip side of it is there's capacity that needs to be built and sustained all the way through. Some of the best work we're doing right now at the World Bank is trying to make sure that that money for climate action goes to community-based livelihood projects where the communities are able to direct how they want that money to be spent. They're able to direct what they need in order to be able to implement what they've decided is their climate action. I'm not sure as I just said, I'm not sure we're their best partner for it. I think our comparative advantage lies more in influencing climate finance architecture, trying to come up with climate finance metrics, strengthening national ministries beyond their ability to churn out national adaptation plans, which kind of feed the global north, but then beyond which you don't see much action. So that's where I leave us on that.
I'll just add, if I could, I mean, I mentioned earlier on the Global Fragility Act, and as I said, that's both the US government itself and how it's configuring internally, but it's also how it's working with its partners in Europe and in civil society. And I do think some of the encouraging things that I've seen developing under the GFA in the last couple of years has been these sort of local solutions and directing US development assistance, but also others towards looking at what do you do to sort of leapfrog perhaps a national government that is maybe not in a position, you mentioned leakage and other things, but to go straight to the community and say, what can we fund at the community level? Now that's incredibly labor intensive, it's time consuming, it doesn't produce instant and real results that you can see in the moment you're doing it, but I think that's the key to durability. And I know, for example, on coastal West Africa, the US and Germany have teamed up to look at local communities in Togo and Benin and elsewhere and sort of ask, what is it you need to help us get at the roots of the conflict that you're seeing, especially in the north of those countries. And I think the conversations they've had and some of the adjustments in the US programs, and I don't know about the German programs yet, have really started to respond to that.
Maybe I'll just add, and I think there is a place for the World Bank, or at least the IFC. So in terms of supporting, ensuring that the commercial banks at the national level have strong ESG safeguards, right? And so then they can on-lend financing from the likes of GCF, GCF, IFC, CIF, and so on. And this is similar work we've done actually with the USAID funding in Southeast Asia, primarily to ensure that there's that finance does flow down to private sector, but local, national level private sector to green the supply chains and reduce emissions. And so we've supported, for example, the Cambodian Association of Banks to strengthen their safeguards, and that way they can be that conduit of financing. So it doesn't quite get to the community directly per se, but the community is part of those supply chains and those value chains at the end of the day.
I would also add, if I may, I think looking at U.S. government-funded programs, particularly within USAID and State Department, there is this push to work at the local level, stemming off localization, journey to self-reliance, all of those buzzwords that we've heard over the past decades. But at the end of the day, there is that recognition that we have to engage elements of local ministries, be that Ministry of Climate, Ministry of Water Resources, whomever, in addition to working with communities. So I think there is, at least within the U.S. funding circles, a recognition that that loop is really important. I think where the breakdown is happening is facilitating that communication between the national level governments and the communities. And I think we have an important role to play there as peace builders, as implementers of donor-funded programs, as funders ourselves, to really solidify those linkages between government entities and communities to help get that money downwards.
If I could just do a two-finger on and piling in on the World Bank a little bit in a nice way. So you mentioned the IFC. I think another agency we've worked with at the World Bank, and I mentioned earlier in my comments about public-private partnerships, is the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency and what they can do to help foster private sector investment that can often be and has to be at the local level. And I've certainly seen examples of that in South Sudan and some other places where there's some investors that are interested, just a little too much risk, they don't really feel comfortable. MEGA of the World Bank, as do some national agencies that look at investment guarantees, has the ability to close that gap and make that investment a reality.
All right, thank you all. It is 3:30, so that is the close of our event. Thank you so much for coming. I'm sure hopefully at least some of our panelists can stick around if you've got a few more questions to ask them, but thank you again, and thank you so much to our panelists and to IEP. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.